Dark Slab Audio on music production and audio engineering. Welcome to Dark Slab Audio in our 5th Master Series. I do believe this is the 7th video in our 5th Master Series, Professional Sounding Results from Your Home Studio. And I do believe this is the 3rd video that will be dealing with environmental concerns. And in this video, we want to take a more scientific look at dealing with our environment and deal with things more as an acoustician would. So let's get started in taking a look at our environment and dealing with things a little more scientifically. Okay, technically and scientifically, first of all, if you remember from the last video, get your soundproofing done properly if you need to. The second thing, again, remember we are not doing scientific work, we're doing music production, so do not have to worry about things being quite so critical. The next thing is you're going to want to read a little bit about architectural engineering. You're going to want to read about room modes, resonances, standing waves, frequency response, and impulse response a little bit to have a little bit better understanding what you're dealing with. Then I suggest you download REW. It is free, and get yourself a measurement microphone so you can test your frequency response before and after you put on treatment. It is the biggest culprit, and no matter what form it comes in, that's probably for the most part what we're trying to deal with, not a reverb echo problem or anything like that. The next thing is the industry has made things very simple for us. We can even make our own, panels and things like that we've talked about a little bit with a little bit of research to save some money. But most things that are rated studio quality will probably get done what you want. So just keep that in mind. The next thing is clean out your room. If it's not necessary for your listening or your recording environment, take it out of your room. Clean it out as much as possible. And the last thing I want to talk about is diffusion panels before we get started. Diffusion panels are great to help retain some quote-unquote life of your room and not deadening it from soundproofing. And I only recommend that if you have a decent sounding room to begin with, or you just like it aesthetically, because it scatters the sound and diffuses it. It will deal with some of your problems, but it doesn't kill the problems. It scatters the sound, and they're used when rooms can have a fairly nice sound to not make the room sound so dead. So that is a personal choice. So let's get on to setting up our room a little more scientifically. Okay, first thing, let's address materials, windows, and doors. First of all, if you have gypsum or something like that in your room, you're probably fairly good to go. If you've got harder materials, concrete, marble, granite, I don't know what all, really heavy wood, the harder, the denser the material is, the more reflective it is, the more you're going to have to get absorption panels on the wall, and the more absorption panels you're going to have to get on the wall, because it starts causing a serious reverb echo problem. So you really need to consider the materials in your room. As far as windows and doors, stay away from them. As far as windows are concerned, you want to seal them off the best you can with absorption panels. You can go look at the birds and the trees later when you're not working. That's my humble opinion and my 2 cents there. Other than that, they reflect some higher frequencies, and a lot of times you can get away with not messing with them too much, and they're not that big a deal because we're not doing scientific work. Your doors, I suggest you put some type of absorption or diffusion panels on them. It looks cool, plus it stops you having to even deal with it or even worry about it. The problem's solved right there. So that's my suggestion as far as your materials and as far in your room and as far as your windows and your doors. So let's start setting up our room. Okay, first of all, no matter in the end where you decide to set up your room or how you set up your room, there's a couple things that we want to take into consideration that are directly related to our listening environment. The first thing is your subwoofer. You want your subwoofer back the same distance as your speakers are, back behind your desk there, preferably, so you're not getting direct sound and more feeling the bass, but centered there back the same distance as your speakers are. That's my first recommendation. The next thing is when you start setting up your room, that your speakers and your desk there, that you're at least 3 or 4 feet from the back wall and 3 or 4 feet from the side walls, and preferably to the skinny end of the room is the preference. Now that might change and you might not be able to do that, but that is preferable. The next thing when we get into, you can put your speakers on stands like this or on the corner of your desk. That is not that critical. What is critical is that when you start setting it up, that this triangle is critical. The distances from each other and the distance to you is critical. The biggest thing you want to keep in mind is not get too wide of a stereo field or too narrow a stereo field. Somewhere in between there is your best option. It doesn't have to be that mathematical. And there's aiming to right here. Your speakers are aiming right here around your shoulder area, right, or your ear, your shoulder area, and this area here, anywhere in this area here. And as far as heights are concerned, between your tweeter and your mid-range, somewhere in there is direct line with your ear. Those are the biggest things you want to keep in mind when just setting up your listening environment as far as we're setting up our room. Where that may be might be a lot different for a lot of people, but try to keep those things in mind as best you can. So let's get on to the next areas of setting up our room. Okay, next of all, the simplest way to try to deal with your room. In my humble opinion, I've laid this out because if you do it this way, this is the simplest way to get it done if you're a small home studio, even professional. So, I mean, if you have your desk set up something like this and you start to lay out panels, that there's a couple things you want to consider. First of all, that your biggest problem is going to be your bass traps, then panels, and then dealing with ceilings. You want to deal with your trihedral corners and you want to deal with your dihedral corners. Optimally, all around the room, you would have panels like this along the ceiling and along the corners. I mean, that is going to be your biggest culprit. And you can get things like, you can get panels or things like this, or do it like this. There's lots of different ones as far as bass traps are concerned, but those are your biggest concerns. Once you've addressed that, the second thing is you have a space halfway between your speakers and your ear. So, you know, that you're going to want to have panels there. So somewhere between here and here, that you're going to want to make sure there's panels on either side of you and the in-between space to stop primary reflections. And on the ceiling, between here and here, on the ceiling hanging in this area also above you. Does that make sense? And behind you, having panels, you can see this direct line that's shooting from here to the listener. You want to make sure there's panels right behind there. You want to make sure there's panels over here where those things are going to get hit, and off to the side where this other panel isn't. And you're going to want to have panels down to the floor where your subwoofer is for when those first primary reflections hit that back wall. See, now this is going to stop most of it. Then you have this paneling over here that's got quite a wide breadth between it here, but you've got your workstation for listening, and you can turn around behind this line. You can drag your amplifier over here, put a microphone here. These initial first responses coming back from this direct line aren't going to bounce around anywhere. And if you put a couple panels up here, like say at this distance and at this distance and at this distance up on the ceiling above there, that's going to deal with the majority of your problems. So you look around here, and basically, scientifically, we're looking at the early reflections being the culprit. Late reflections normally aren't that big a deal, and anything that escapes out here is not going to be that big a deal. And if you happen to have this set up over here in the corner or something like that, Besides having this panel behind you, you can have one onto the side of you also to create a false wall there, to try to build yourself in a little bit in with that mentality. We have to remember this space in here, walking in and out of here, is not going to be that big a deal. But this is going to deal with the majority of your problems. You've got bass traps in there, you've got traps on the ceiling in both these areas, you got traps behind you or absorption panels on the side of you, and you're pretty much good to go. You can be just about guaranteed, you leave a space between here and here, you're probably going to be okay. Does that make sense? And the rest of it, you're good to go. You've got a great place that's a great workstation, and you can turn right around. You can have keyboards back here, microphones, amplifiers that you can set up pointed directly at these absorption panels that are hung across here, that direct sound is going to get absorbed and not bounce around nowhere. You've got panels on the ceiling to where any of this can bounce off the floor. It's going to hit somewhere here, bro, more than likely not the microphone. Okay, and you are going to probably cure 90% of your problems or more. So you're probably going to be good to go. I mean, right there is a really great, simple setup for dealing with your acoustical issues that takes very little measuring. You've got some in-between points here, and you've dealt with basically your problems. All the other problems that happen when we're trying to deal with acoustical treatment and acoustically treating our rooms are being dealt with right there. The only problems you don't have, soundproofing, against outside intrusions and things like that. But other than that, your problem is basically solved. I mean, you've basically got it done. So that's my first recommendation as the most simple recommendation and the best workstation for a small home studio, even a small professional studio. Now, this wall can be moved back if you've got more equipment and things like that. You can always move closer into that if you need more space in there, but make sure you kind of keep an eye on these lines and what's going on. That way, with any of the other sound that's escaping out here into this other area of your room that might be for sitting or composing or whatever you might be doing, that it's not really affecting your area that you're working in, working with your music productions when you're recording and or when you're listening. And that basically will take care of your problems. So that is my first scientific solution without getting out a calculator and trying to map it all out. That will probably deal with your problems. So let's get on to the next solution that's a little more drastic. Okay, first of all, if you have some type of different setup or you don't have any choice but to put things in the corners and things like that, between the last video, this video, and the next video, that you should be able to find some type of hybrid solution to deal with the issues you have because of space or the way your room's laid out. So it's going to take a little thinking on your part, but you should be able to find a fairly functional solution. Next of all, we want to talk about, we're dealing with our corners like we talked about before in the last section, that preferably along the ceiling and along these corners that you've got panels of some type that are going to deal with your primary problems. So that is the first thing that needs to get addressed. And then we go into your room itself. Now, first of all, that you want at least 50 to 75% coverage. You want your panels about 2 foot up from the floor, at least going about a foot above ear height. And the only exception to that is down where your subwoofer is, to have those panels going to the floor so that we're dealing with primary reflections, right? They're going to be heard and cause the problems we have. That is going to deal with our problems like our standing waves, our resonances, and our modal distribution problems are going to be dealt with here. We have our listening area and we have our recording area. And anything escaping out of these areas is going to come back and hit some of these panels somewhere and bounce around and not end up probably causing a solution. I've laid it out this way so that it'll kind of function that way. So first of all, we deal with our listening area and then our recording area. Our listening area, we have this setup like we talked about in the last section. We've got our speakers angled at us. So behind them, we have a couple panels. Over here in the direct line, we have panels there. We have where the subwoofer is down below there. We've got panels there, and up where these panels are, the same as there. On the side from where the speakers are and from where our chair is, and in between there to stop those primary reflections, we have panels, and up above us in about an area about like this from where their speakers are, out about like that to where we're listening, we have panels hanging from the ceiling. Now, this setup is going to solve your problems. All those problems you have when you're dealing with acoustical issues are going to get solved. And anything escaping out of there is going to bounce around and hit some of these other panels more than likely. Anything that escapes out of it, that is more than likely not going to be any kind of a major issue for you. So just kind of have to keep that in mind. And we go over to our listening or our recording area, that we've got an area rug, even if we have carpet there. We've got our amplifiers or microphones set up to this point forward, and then we have panels over here. We've got panels back behind here. Anything hitting over here is more likely going to bounce into this bass trap or over here. Up above us on the ceiling, we have an area like this that's about the same coverage or close to it as like these panels are out to here and these panels out to here in a square above that. And then these speakers pointed at the direct center of where these absorption panels are. Now, this is going to solve your acoustical problems. Any of the problems that you would be having are being dealt with. Out in here, you may have a couple areas where you might have some standing waves between these two open areas or over here, but nowhere where you're listening, right? So you don't have to worry about it. Anywhere where you're listening, there's panels on either side. There's no place for resonances to really take root. There's no place for it to be no modal distribution problems. And if you turn this into a listening area or something, put a couch in here, you may have to address the acoustical areas in this area like you would this right here for listening in this area. But other than that, your problems are solved. You aren't going to have any of those problems happening. Any residual problems you have will be dealt with in normal editing and processing. So that is my technical version of it, without trying to make you an acoustician or make you study being an acoustician so much to where you'd be better off calling an acoustician, because I do suggest you download REW, take some measurements, and study about the software. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to call an acoustician, but something like this will take care of your problems. Now, between the last video, this video, and the next video, if you have some other type of setup or your room set up differently or something like that, you should be able to find some type of hybrid solution to solve your problems if you can't get it set up in the ways we've talked about so far. In the next video, we'll just talk about audio engineering solutions, and between all of them, you should be able to find a fairly functional solution that any residual effects that are caused, you'll be able to deal with in normal editing and processing. So I really hope you enjoyed this next video on dealing with our environmental concerns, and I will see you in the next video.